what is also difficult is to understand that so many of those students, they're second-time survivors now because they've already seen this before as survivors of gun violence in school or community, and now yet again. So it's horrific. And I have to say, this is not an inevitability. And that's what frustrates me so much is that we have what we need to make sure that this doesn't happen again, but we're not doing everything.
You heard her voice, and you need to hear it again, because what she just said contains the kernel of truth that should burn through every single layer of complacency and political cowardice that has calcified around this issue, like scar tissue around a wound that never heals. She said this is not an inevitability, and those words should detonate in your consciousness because 2 students just died at Brown University, and 9 others were wounded, and you're about to learn why every single one of those deaths represents not just a tragedy, but an active political choice that was made by people in power who decided that certain lives simply don't matter enough to overcome the structural impediments to change. And here's the first bombshell that you need to internalize immediately, because everything that follows depends on understanding this foundational reality. At least 2 students at Brown had survived previous school shooting, which means we have now entered a phase of American decline, so profound and so morally bankrupt that we are manufacturing a generation of children who survive massacres only to experience them again, a recursive nightmare of violence that compounds trauma upon trauma in ways that should shatter any remaining pretense that this nation possesses even a shred of commitment to the welfare of its young people. The executive director speaking in that clip knows something that conservatives desperately want you to forget, which is that so far in 2025, there have been at least 391 mass shootings and 13,929 shooting deaths in the United States, according to the Gun Violence Archive, and those numbers should obliterate any remaining credibility of the argument that guns make us safer, or that the solution to gun violence is more guns, or that mental health is really the issue here, rather than the catastrophic proliferation of weapons designed explicitly to maximize human casualties in minimum time. And you want to know what makes this even more devastating? Saturday's shooting came on the eve of the 13th anniversary of the Sandy Hook School massacre, which means we have spent 13 years in the purgatory of national inaction. 13 years of thoughts and prayers, 13 years of Republicans blocking every meaningful reform, while children continue to die in classrooms that should be sanctuaries of learning, but have instead become killing fields where young people practice active shooter drills with the same regularity that previous generations practiced fire drills. Now here comes the second bombshell that should radicalize anyone with even a passing commitment to justice, and you need to understand the full scope of what's happening, because students who have lived through multiple school shootings include survivors of the 2018 Parkland shooting who enrolled at Florida State University, where a gunman killed 2 people, and a woman who lived through shootings at both Oxford High School in Michigan and Michigan State University, which means the phenomenon of repeat victimization is not an aberration, but an emerging pattern that reflects the sheer statistical inevitability of gun violence when you live in a nation that has more firearms than people and political institutions captured by an industry that profits from death. Think about what that means for a moment, because the psychological architecture of that reality is almost too horrifying to contemplate. You survive a massacre as a teenager, you carry that trauma with you, you try to rebuild your life, you go to college seeking some semblance of normalcy, and then it happens again. The active shooter alarm, the hiding under desks, the sounds of gunfire, the uncertainty about whether you'll survive, the knowledge that some of your friends won't, and the crushing realization that this country fundamentally does not value your life enough to implement policies that every other developed nation has successfully deployed to prevent exactly this kind of carnage. The woman in that clip said we have what we need to make sure this doesn't happen again, and she is absolutely correct because we know exactly what works, since we have decades of empirical evidence from nations that have actually prioritized human life over gun industry profits. Universal background checks work, waiting periods work, red flag laws work, assault weapons bans work, limitations on magazine capacity work, safe storage requirements work, and comprehensive licensing systems work. But here's the third bombshell that explains why none of those policies have been implemented at the federal level despite overwhelming public support. The conservative movement in this country has built an entire ideological apparatus around the maximalist interpretation of the Second Amendment that treats any regulation whatsoever as tyrannical overreach, while simultaneously maintaining a conspiracy theory mindset that imagines government confiscation and authoritarian takeover lurking behind every modest policy proposal. And this isn't just about the NRA or gun manufacturers funneling money into Republican campaigns, though that's certainly part of it, but rather about a deeper pathology within conservative politics that has fetishized gun ownership as a totemic symbol of freedom, while remaining utterly indifferent to the bodies that pile up as a consequence of that ideological commitment. Now watch what happens, because since the shooting at Columbine High School in 1999, more than 390,000 students in the U.S. have experienced gun violence at school, and that number should fundamentally alter your understanding of what we're discussing here, because we're not talking about isolated incidents or random acts of violence, but rather a systemic crisis that has traumatized hundreds of thousands of young people whose educational experiences have been permanently scarred by the threat and reality of armed violence. And here's where the analysis needs to go deeper, because when you examine the approximately 50,000 children per year who have been experiencing shootings at their schools in recent times, this amounts to an aggregate cost of $5.8 billion per year in terms of lost lifetime earnings among survivors. Which means gun violence in schools represents not just a public health catastrophe and a moral abomination, but also an economic disaster that impoverishes our collective future by destroying the human capital and psychological well-being of an entire generation. The research shows that even these less deadly and mostly unpublicized acts of gun violence at schools have major and long-lasting consequences for many children who were on school grounds when they occurred, which demolishes the conservative talking point that we should only care about the high-profile massacres while ignoring the daily drumbeat of smaller-scale violence that pervades American schools. And you need to understand the cruel mathematics of political failure here, because there have been 17 school shootings this year that resulted in injuries or deaths, and there have been 238 such shootings since 2018, which means we're averaging more than 30 school shootings per year in a country that claims to value children, while simultaneously refusing to implement the regulations that would dramatically reduce those numbers. Every single one of those shootings represents a failure of political will, a capitulation to gun industry lobbying, and a betrayal of the social contract that is supposed to guarantee children safe spaces for learning and development. The executive director in that clip talked about students being second-time survivors, and you need to sit with that phrase because it encapsulates everything that's broken about our approach to gun violence. We have created conditions in which surviving a school shooting once is no longer sufficient protection against experiencing it again, in which trauma is layered upon trauma, in which the psychological architecture of childhood has been fundamentally reorganized around the expectation of violence. Here comes another bombshell, because the day after the Brown shooting was the 13th anniversary of the 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, and the anti-gun violence nonprofit Sandy Hook Promise released a statement saying we cannot allow this to keep happening, and we must end gun violence. Which should remind us that even the most devastating massacres in American history have failed to generate sufficient political momentum to overcome Republican obstruction in Congress. Think about that for a moment, because 20 elementary school children were murdered at Sandy Hook, and we couldn't even pass universal background checks in the aftermath, which tells you everything you need to know about how thoroughly the conservative movement has subordinated child welfare to ideological rigidity and corporate interests. The political economy of gun violence in America is structured such that a relatively small number of manufacturers and a well-organized activist minority can successfully veto policies supported by overwhelming majorities of Americans, including gun owners, which represents a fundamental crisis of democratic legitimacy that extends far beyond the specific issue of firearms. Now let's talk about what the research actually shows regarding school shooting survivors, because there is a need to understand the long-term mental health impacts of school shootings across the life course, and to explore a wider range of outcomes, communities, and timeframes. And the evidence demonstrates that survivors report enduring psychological challenges that extend far beyond the immediate aftermath of the event, and recovery from school shootings is often non-linear, marked by periods of progress and setbacks. This matters because conservatives often deploy the narrative that children are resilient and will bounce back from trauma, which functions as an excuse for inaction by minimizing the lasting damage that gun violence inflicts on developing brains and psyches. But the empirical reality is that even those who escape these events without any visible physical harm carry scars that could impair their lives for many years to come, which means every single school shooting creates concentric circles of trauma that radiate outward to affect not just direct victims, but entire communities, entire cohorts of students, entire generations of young people who have grown up under the shadow of potential massacre. And here's where we need to confront the most damning aspect of conservative political theology around guns, because the Second Amendment fundamentalism that dominates right-wing discourse treats any infringement on gun rights as categorically impermissible, regardless of the human cost, which creates a moral framework in which dead children become acceptable collateral damage in the defense of an abstract principle. This is not hyperbole or uncharitable interpretation, but rather an accurate description of the revealed preferences of conservative politicians who consistently block gun safety legislation while offering nothing but platitudes and diversions in response to mass shootings. They'll talk about mental health despite voting against mental health funding. They'll talk about school security despite voting against education funding. They'll talk about armed teachers despite the complete absence of evidence that such policies reduce casualties. And they'll talk about anything other than the actual problem, which is that we have flooded this country with weapons specifically designed for rapid mass killing and created legal structures that make those weapons easily accessible to people who intend to use them for exactly that purpose. The executive director said we have what we need to make sure this doesn't happen again, and you need to understand that she's referring to evidence-based policies that have been successfully implemented in other countries and in some American states. When people see the warning signs and get help, we can end school shootings. As in 4 out of 5 school shootings, at least one other person had knowledge of the attacker's plan but failed to report it, which points toward intervention strategies that could prevent violence before it occurs. But here's the crucial point that separates progressive analysis from conservative deflection. Individual intervention is necessary but not sufficient, because the structural conditions that enable mass shootings require structural solutions, not just better vigilance or more mental health resources or enhanced security protocols. You need both the micro-level interventions and the macro-level policy changes, both the community-based prevention and the legislative action that restricts access to the most dangerous weapons and requires responsible storage and implements waiting periods and establishes comprehensive background check systems. Now I'm about to drop another bombshell that connects gun violence to broader patterns of structural inequality, because children of color are far more likely to experience campus gun violence, more than twice as much for Hispanic students and over 3 times as much for Black students, which means gun violence in America operates along the same fault lines of racial injustice that structure every other dimension of American life. This is not coincidental, but rather reflects how patterns of segregation, disinvestment, policing, and economic marginalization create differential exposure to violence that maps onto racial hierarchies. Children living in poverty, both urban and rural, are more likely to die due to gun violence than their more affluent peers, which demonstrates how gun violence intersects with class oppression to create conditions in which poor children and children of color bear disproportionate burdens of America's refusal to regulate firearms. This should radicalize anyone who claims to care about racial justice or economic justice, because you cannot separate gun violence from the broader matrix of structural violence that characterizes American capitalism and American racism. The woman in that clip expressed frustration at the gap between what we know works and what we're actually doing, and that frustration should metastasize into rage when you understand the scale of political failure involved. There were 39 school shootings with injuries or deaths last year, 38 in 2023, 51 in 2022, 35 in 2021, which means we're experiencing roughly 1 school shooting per week during the school year, a pace of violence so normalized that most of these incidents receive minimal national attention unless the body count reaches double digits. Think about how thoroughly we have accommodated ourselves to atrocity when a shooting that injures 3 or 4 students barely registers in the national consciousness, when we've developed informal thresholds for newsworthiness based on casualty counts, when the background radiation of gun violence has become so pervasive that only the most spectacular massacres penetrate the fog of our collective desensitization. And here's where progressive analysis needs to connect gun violence to the broader project of building a society that actually values human flourishing, rather than property rights and corporate profits. The same political movement that blocks gun safety legislation also opposes universal health care, fights against expanded mental health services, defunds public education, militarizes police while opposing accountability, and constructs an entire political economy organized around the maximization of private wealth rather than collective well-being. Gun violence in America is not an isolated problem, but rather a symptom of a deeper societal sickness that prioritizes the freedom of capital over the freedom from violence, that treats human life as expendable when it conflicts with ideological commitments or economic interest, that constructs elaborate justifications for accepting preventable death rather than implementing policies that might constrain profitable industries or cherished cultural practices. The students at Brown who crouched under desks and behind locked doors for 9 hours, making panicked phone calls and sending "I love you" texts that felt dangerously close to goodbyes, deserve to know that their terror was not inevitable, that their trauma was not the price of freedom, that their victimization represents a political choice made by people who could have chosen differently, but didn't because they valued other things more than student safety. The shooting occurred at around 4 p.m. at the Engineering and Physics building in an economics class, as students were taking their final exams, which means young people trying to demonstrate their learning and advance their educational goals were attacked in one of the spaces that should be most secure and most devoted to human development. Every school shooting represents a violation of the social contract, a betrayal of the promise that education will be a pathway to opportunity rather than a site of trauma and death. Now let's talk about the specific mechanisms of political failure, because understanding how we got here is essential to understanding how we get out. The conservative coalition that blocks gun safety legislation consists of Second Amendment absolutists who genuinely believe any regulation threatens tyranny, gun industry representatives and lobbyists whose economic interests depend on maximizing sales, Republican politicians who have tied their electoral fortunes to gun rights messaging and fear, primary challenges from the right, if they support reform, and rural voters who view gun ownership as culturally central and perceive urban gun control advocates as threatening their way of life. This coalition has successfully deployed procedural tools like the filibuster to block legislation even when clear majorities support reform, has captured state legislatures to preempt local gun regulations, has appointed federal judges who interpret the Second Amendment in maximalist terms, and has created a political environment in which even modest proposals trigger apocalyptic rhetoric about confiscation and tyranny. Breaking this coalition requires not just winning elections, but fundamentally transforming the political terrain on which debates about gun violence occur. It requires connecting gun safety to broader questions about whose freedom matters and whose lives are valued. It requires exposing the class dynamics whereby wealthy people can insulate themselves from gun violence through private security and exclusive neighborhoods while working-class communities bear the burden of unregulated firearms. It requires centering the voices of survivors and victims' families rather than treating them as props in political theater. It requires sustained organizing and movement building rather than episodic outrage that fades as the news cycle moves on. It requires understanding that the fight for gun safety is inseparable from fights against racism, poverty, patriarchy, and the corporate capture of democratic institutions. The executive director said we're not doing everything that we can do, and that's an understatement, bordering on euphemism because we're not doing even a fraction of what we could do. We're not implementing even the most basic policies that enjoy supermajority support. We're not taking even the minimal steps that would save lives without significantly burdening gun owners. The gap between what's politically possible and what's politically actual reveals the dysfunction of American democracy, the extent to which our institutions have been captured by minority factions and moneyed interests that can veto popular will, and this should drive us toward more radical analysis and more transformative demands because incremental reform within existing structures has failed catastrophically and will continue to fail as long as the fundamental power dynamics remain unchanged. One student at Brown said, "I found a place where I finally started to feel comfortable, and it's been taken again," noting that she is now part of a grim community of students who have lived through multiple school shootings, and that testimony should haunt anyone who claims this country has done enough, or tried hard enough, or cares sufficiently about child welfare. We have manufactured a reality in which multiple-time school shooting survivors are an emerging demographic category, in which trauma compounds upon trauma, in which the safe spaces we promise to young people are repeatedly violated by armed violence that we refuse to prevent despite knowing exactly how to do so. This is not an accident or an unfortunate inevitability, but rather the predictable consequence of political choices made by people with names and addresses and donor lists, people who could be voted out of office, people whose power depends on our acquiescence and apathy. So when that executive director says this massacre was preventable, believe her, internalize that truth, and let it radicalize you toward demanding systemic change, rather than accepting the status quo as inevitable. 2 students were killed, and 9 other students were wounded, as they attended a review session in preparation for final exams. And those deaths represent not divine judgment or random fate, but political failure, institutional capture, and moral bankruptcy. Every single person who has blocked gun safety legislation, who has taken NRA money, who has deployed Second Amendment absolutism to prevent reform, who has prioritized abstract rights over concrete lives, bears responsibility for creating the conditions in which school shootings occur with such regularity that we've developed sophisticated tracking systems and memorialized the names of hundreds of school shooting sites. The work ahead requires not just policy advocacy, but political transformation, not just winning votes but changing consciousness, not just electing better leaders but building movements powerful enough to overcome entrenched interests and ideological rigidity. The students who survived Brown deserve nothing less than our complete commitment to ensuring that what happened to them never happens to anyone else, and that commitment demands recognizing that this is not just a gun issue but a justice issue. Not just a safety concern but a fundamental question about what kind of society we want to build and whose lives we're willing to value.